social justice and emancipation. And we are so excited this morning. I've got some wonderful guests with me, and I'd like for them to introduce themselves. We'll start with our middle guest and work our way to the right.
Hi, my name is Dr. Denise Shaver.
All right.
Hi, I'm Leslie Pollard.
All right. It needs no introduction. So we have a wonderful topic to talk about this morning. I guess we'll just jump right in. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes. So let's start with our first slide, and I'll ask Dr. Pollard this first question. And how can we, as Black Adventists, understand and then conceptualize what the beast of Revelation 13 and the United States represents in the backdrop to our commission given to us in Revelation 14?
Okay, thank you, Elder Taylor. That's an excellent question.
Yes.
And of course, as our listeners know, we're studying the Emancipation Liberation Lessons.
Thank you.
As we've been doing in Black History. I know we were moving quickly. During Black History Month. And this week, we're looking at the Seventh-day Adventist message through the eyes of liberation. Okay, so to answer your question, how can we understand the backdrop of Revelation 14, 6 through 12? I think a big piece of this is to understand that Revelation 14, 6 through 12 represents the explosive spread of a final message to the world. And Seventh-day Adventists, we've seen ourselves as a part of that. Now, in the context of the book of Revelation, what it really speaks to ultimately is the proclaimed victory of God over all the enemies in the book of Revelation. That makes sense?
Yes.
Over all the enemies. You got multiple enemies, the dragon, the beast, the false prophet, all these enemies. Well, one of those enemies is the lamb-like beast in Revelation chapter 13. One of those enemies that will be overcome and will be defeated. This is an oppressive, persecuting power. And Seventh-day Adventists identified that power as America. So when you look at, so here is the upshot, though, of what the Adventist pioneers did that is different than what we do today. What we do today is we say, one day, America will be that dragon that looks like a lamb, that beast that looks like a lamb but speaks like a dragon.
Okay.
One day it will do that, and when it takes our religious rights and our religious ability to worship, because it makes all worship and that kind of thing. Okay, so here's the quick, so all of that to say this, that is exactly the opposite of what the pioneers did.
Oh, yes.
They said the evidence that America is this beast is its enslavement of black people. And again, I think we got some slides that kind of...
It was up, Doc.
I said, oh, it's up. Okay, I was looking at the back there. Okay,
Yes.
So when you look at that slide, and I'm sorry, I can't read it from you. Oh, there it is. Okay, so now this is one of the Adventist pioneers. This gentleman here is named J.N. Andrews. Andrews University is named after him. This is what he said. When you go through it now, let's go down to about the third sentence. In appearance, he is like a harmless lamb, but when he raises his voice in acts of authority, his dragon-like character is revealed. Now, these are the Adventist pioneers writing in the Adventist Review. He said, this is a two-faced, hypocritical beast that first appears with mildness and equity, but has fierce promptings of a dragon's heart. The institution of slavery most clearly reveals the dragon spirit of this, he's talking about the United States, this hypocritical nation.
Big word, hypocritical nation.
That's what he said. And this is a pioneer of the Adventist Church, J.N. Andrews, our first missionary.
That's pretty deep. And I'll tell you this, Dr. Pollard, what we're saying is twofold in its confusion.
Oh, okay.
And that is when we begin to just dig into eschatology, I mean, it gets hard. But then when you couple that with a nation that we now live in, it's really a hard application, but it's so appropriate what you just expressed to us, that this country, Revelation 13, and you can even go back to Revelation 12 because the dragon gives its power. So we begin to understand where we are in today's time.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you
it's
for
a
that.
profound. I just add, it's a profound understanding, and I think you're going to talk about it later, But contrary to the Christian nationalism that we see today, the early pioneers would be anything but Christian nationalists because they understood the nature of the great controversy and the where we are in the stream of history.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Doc. So our next question, we'll come to you, Dr. Shaver. Our next question is pertaining to our next slide. And from a historical and current perspective, what makes the United States unworthy of her praise? And I believe we'll be able to see this, if we go to our next slide.
So that is a very complex question because in many ways, America was the beacon of democracy and freedom.
Yes.
But the dichotomy and the hypocrisy is that they were also the largest enslavers of the time.
Yes.
Europe liberated slaves much earlier than America did. And America had slavery for approximately 244 years, and then, as we all know, subsequent types of oppression, right? Sharecropping, right?
Jim Crow.
Jim Crow, right? The convict lease system. And of course, today, right, we have our whole penal system that's designed to benefit off of free labor. And so you cannot have a country that promotes democracy and freedom, and it's the largest enslaving country. It's almost insanity, right?
Yes.
And so while, as Frederick Douglass said, we can't celebrate the 4th of July. It's hypocrisy, right? How can we enjoy this celebration of freedom in chains? And even today, the word vestiges is inaccurate because there's still very clear links and practices that keep oppression going in many ways that affect African Americans and people of color in general. And so it's not truly worthy of the praise until it lives up to its principles in the fullest way possible.
And do we expect as a people for the United States to live up to their principles?
Well, I think when I teach African American history at Oakwood, and I've taught it for years, but when I teach it here, I tell them that you have to study African American history with a lens, and my lens is the great controversy.
Wow.
So the truth of the matter is, nothing will be ideal on planet Earth,
Yes.
right? Because it's not a race problem, it's not a sex problem, it's a sin problem.
That's deep.
It is.
It's a sin problem.
That's profound, isn't it?
It is.
And that's a unique lens, which I think says that given the correct circumstances or a different set of circumstances, anyone will oppress anybody if they can get away with it. That's right. Given so one of the dangers, I think, and I think Dr. Shaver has so aptly put it, one of the dangers is only racializing our history. What Seventh-day Adventists bring to this is the great controversy perspective that says that the sin problem, I love your language, the sin problem would mean that anyone, I've said this when I teach some of my classes in leadership, I said, yes, in history, men have oppressed women.
Yes.
But unless women are inherently virtuous, then if women had the opportunity, they would oppress men.
Yeah.
That's the sin problem.
Okay, now it's quiet, right? Now it's
Yes,
quiet. But again, do you agree, Doc?
Yes,
I mean, if
absolutely.
it's a sin problem,
It's a
right?
sin problem.
If it's a sin problem.
Wow. And that's pretty deep. And it's hard for us, when we are oppressed or underserved,
Yeah.
It's hard to look at it that way. And we thank you for that.
But we have to address the problem where it expresses itself, though. So in American history, it has expressed itself on some level racially, and therefore it has to be addressed on that level.
Absolutely.
But over and above and beyond that, I think that's where we have a perspective that says, while we address it here, there's also a larger cosmic battle that's also being fought and being played out in this little arena.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. So that slide, the question, there was a slide to that question that would support it, but we having some technical difficulty here. So it said right here, that's what you answered. The United States government is a great idol, altogether unworthy of the adoration which it receives. Statesmen Politicians, preachers, all classes and grades strive to outdo each other in singing praises to this union of the democratic professions. And what's that word, Dr. Pollard?
Slavocratic. Now this is really 1800 Victorian
Yes.
language, right?
Yes.
Slavocratic. And I think for our audience, Malcolm, I sent you some of these slides because people think that you have to step away from the some people think, you have to step away from the Seventh-day Adventist message,
Right.
Dr. Shaver, to be concerned about social justice, equity, inclusion, emancipation. But these people that we're looking at, these are the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Yes.
So the question for us today is, what did they see in our message that was inherently activistic and liberationist? Because they saw something, otherwise they wouldn't be saying those things.
Wow.
And the Adventist Church was actually one of the few churches that was very vocally against slavery
Absolutely.
during that time, which was very progressive for such
Absolutely.
a small new church to take a stance on something very unpopular at that time. And so the founders were very aware of living the gospel truth, right?
Yes.
To love mercy,
Yes.
to have compassion for one another, equity and fairness. These are the foundations of Christianity, right? And so that transcends and should transcend culture, but it doesn't always do so.
So we can find an appreciation in our founders
Yes.
for their
Absolutely.
abolitionist ways.
Absolutely.
Yes, yes. Well, let's go to the next question, Dr. Pollard. This is the gospel appeal. Our gospel message should be held sacred, but in America, Christian nationalism and greed trump, no pun intended, this message from Jesus. What is our part in this gospel appeal?
Oh boy, that is a great question, because one of the things that we see emerging today is a Christian nationalism. And a lot of scholars have been studying this phenomenon because it represents so much that's dangerous. It represents so much. It completely loses sight of the great controversy perspective, and it sets people on a path to Christianizing America. And once you try to Christianize America, then automatically you're going to persecute some people.
Yes.
So because you sent me the question early, Doc, that's always dangerous, right?
Yes,
So I did a little research. Can I just a little bit? Short, very short. I know you're anxious about the time. I know you're, because you've warned us about that. So Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry did a large-scale study, 16,000 adherents, and they asked the following questions. These questions, now people who read Revelation 13 should be aware of this. Okay. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. That's part of the survey. The federal government should advocate Christian values. The federal government should enforce strict separation of church and state. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public places. The success of the United States is a part of God's plan.
And so, and the challenge with that is, who's going to define what Christianity,
Christianity
in America looks
is.
like,
That's it.
and what are those Christian practices and values, what should they be?
Exactly.
So once we establish that nationally, right, that's going to be a
Somebody's
problem.
gonna be
That's going to be a
persecuted.
problem
Somebody's
for
gonna be
somebody.
persecuted.
Whoever doesn't adhere to those
Yes.
standards and norms.
Somebody's going to be persecuted.
Are gonna
well,
be
well, in this
outcasts.
survey, to make Dr. Shaver's point, in this survey, 52% of the people surveyed, in general, agreed. But here is the kicker. The Protestant evangelicals, 88% of them agreed. Now, if you study Revelation,
Yes.
you remember this, who's going to join hands,
hands,
right?
yes.
And do these kind of things. So when you think about it, Christian nationalism is a real danger. And there have been times when, if we are not careful, we will join that, because there's also an Adventist patriotism that often is at work. But we have to separate it. And our pioneers were able to help us see clearly through the fog that this is not a Christian nation.
Right.
It's not that.
Yes.
The founders were not practicing evangelical Christians, contrary to what you hear on some of the popular television stations.
Right.
Most of them were deists. And deists, we call those the clockmaker religion. You know, God winds a clock, sits it down, he just lets it run.
That's at work.
That's the way they thought about history. God is not involved with history. History got started, here we are. It's up to us to do something with it. So I think, and Dr. Shaver wants to jump in here, so I think we have to be careful because, as she said, when someone decides that the nation is Christian, then you've got to decide what set of practices define that Christianity. And we know from Revelation one day there will be some very clear and strict definitions of what it means to be an American citizen who is in a Christian nation.
And this is when we have to have our eyes wide open because, our history, we're Protestants.
Yes.
And if you say 80% of Protestants would like to rewind the clock and go back to what we ran from, our brothers and sisters who came from Europe.
Good point.
Isn't that oxymoronic? I mean, we are actually redoing what we ran from as Protestants.
Well, she's the historian,
yes.
But you know that it's going to go full circle. Right?
It is. And even, ironically, the original runners from persecution, when they first came to the United States, they also wanted to enforce strict rules on what Christianity to be, and they were just running from that.
Wow.
And so it was founders, the founder of Rhode Island, that reminded them, hey, we're running from persecution. Yeah, we're running from persecution, yes, Williams. And that said that. So we have to constantly remember our history so that we don't let this get away.
Wow. And if we don't remember our history, we're doomed to repeat it, aren't we?
We will certainly do.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
Absolutely.
So we'll move on to this next question. I think this next question is designed to create a lot of dialogue, and it says this is finding our place in organization, in organizing for mission. What are your thoughts concerning what looks like separate but equal actions in our North American division? And this involves our regional conferences, our divisions, our churches, and church schools, K through 12 and beyond. So what are our thoughts on this separate but equal practice that seems to be evident in our work?
Well, I could go first, but I went first the last time.
So separate but equal as we understand it, again, in real context, never works. Because there's always a pull for someone to have more. That's a human problem. And so as we struggle to have separate but equal, we have to look at, are things equitably distributed from our denominational perspective? Historically, have we done that, right? And so if we could honestly balance that, then there may be some discussion, but it's not really feasible. But I still believe that because of all of the foundational racist and practices that have been inherent in American history and still current, there's still a need for some separation because of the lack of equal distribution that has plagued us.
Okay, well, I'm going to throw an audible as well inside of this question.
You called an audible?
Because I need your help. Because my generation and the generations behind me, what I see in my lens, I'm Adventist education from Yay High on up. I went to Pine Forge, but Blue Mountain Academy looked a whole lot different from my school.
Exactly.
I went to Oakwood University, then Oakwood College, but our counterparts looked a whole lot different. And when I say that, audience, their support financially, their support even behind the scenes seemed to be so much more robust. So for those of us who have come up in Christian education and may see it from my lens, help us out with that, Doc. Can you?
Okay, sure. So first of all, I think when we talk about the current Adventist system, I'm trying to summarize some things. So I've written articles and published them on this. And I published one in 2018. I published two during Black History Month in the Adventist Review on race, culture, and mission. So I would encourage others to read it. It's February 20 and 27 of 2018, where I go into great detail about this, but I'm giving you the short version now. So first of all, I think when you think about, let's go back to the founding of regional conferences, because out of that grows a lot of the conversation that we hear. So there is no question that the early black pioneers requested full integration. What they were handed were conferences. That's what they were handed. So someone said they requested integration, they were handed segregation.
Wow.
But the way of the world at the time was in fact that. Okay. But what I think, as you look at history, part of the point I make in the article is that history doesn't have to be perfect to be purposeful. And here's why. In April 12, 1944, when this decision was made, one was, we are not ready to integrate. There was a sociological rationale, but there was also a missiological rationale. They gave two reasons. If you look at the original texts, they gave two reasons. One is that we think it's early, it's premature. And guess what, everybody? I know this is not popular now. What I'm about to say is not popular. But if you look at the times, now we're reading this through 21st century eyes, but if you look at the times,
yes,
very little was integrated. That was a fairly radical proposal. The military hadn't been integrated at that time. Jackie Robinson hadn't come into baseball at that time. So there were a number of things. So that raises a question about whether or not integration is some sort of absolute value. I don't think it is, but I'd be prepared to discuss that. I don't think it is. I think practical considerations did. So the first part was, to abbreviate this, the first part was that we don't think we're ready to do that. The second part was...
And this is our white counterpart.
Yes, this is General Conference, right? This is the General Conference saying this. And Mrs. Bayard dying in the Washington Sand lobby, all of the things that we know through history, but there was a second part to the rationale. The second part was, it appears to us that when the work is in the hands of the colored people, it grows faster.
It does.
Now, that's a missiological rationale, right?
Yes.
Everything you see today, Oakwood and all the rest, have been the beneficiaries of that missiological rationale, however misguided the original rationale was. Like Joseph said to his brothers, he said, now you didn't mean this for good. But God took it and turned it to good. So history doesn't have to be perfect to be purposeful. Should Joseph have been sold? Should it have been? No. But God had a way of taking history and transforming it into a good purpose. And now, 350,000 members later, Oakwood University now is thriving as a part. I mean, it's just remarkable what has happened. So I'm a little bit different than the people who say, oh, isn't this awful? I don't think so. I think there's a thing in the gospel, a place in the gospel for mission particularity. And now, let me just speak to one other thing that I said. May as well. Here we go. If integration is an absolute value, then every ethnic church is in violation of the gospel.
Right.
Japanese, Latino. Right now, on campus, we got 700 Latinos who are worshiping today and a baptism of 40 people, right? Yeah. Okay. If that is an absolute value, then I lived at Loma Linda University. We had 30 churches within a 15-mile radius of Loma Linda. We had Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, two kinds of Filipino churches. One that spoke Tagalog and the other that spoke Visayan. If integration is an absolute value, then every ethnic church is in violation. Now, are we prepared to go that far? So if we would do that at the local level, is there any violation in bringing together those collective churches to accomplish the work among particular people groups? I say no. So I'm different than the people who say, ooh, it's awful, and we're so segregated. By the way, segregation is a legal position.
Right.
We're not segregated. I can go join any church, and anyone can join, as is evidenced, the Oakwood Church. So that's kind of the way I see it, and that's a long explanation, but the articles lay it out. February 20 and 27, Adventist Review, 2018, you can see the whole rationale with all the footnotes and all the documentation.
Thank you for that answer.
So I just wanted to
Oh,
concur.
and may I just say one other thing? The funding inequities then, because that's a big piece, okay?
That's a big piece.
Some of that is the way this church is designed, and that needs to be fixed.
Okay.
Just like we did with the regional retirement plan.
Yes.
Because the socioeconomics, I see Dr. Prudence is sitting here, when we put together the OU Care program, the socioeconomic work that her committee did shows that, 60 cents on a dollar? Well, there's a translated effect when your people group earns less than the majority people group. That's why, what was that called? Blue Mountain? Thunderbird?
Yes, Blue Mountain Academy.
Blue Mountain.
Why it looks one way and Pine Forge looks another way. But we can fix Pine Forge. You see, that's up to us too. And I know
That's
I got
a
a
great
lot of
point.
Pine Forge people here. We can fix Pine Forge. We need to come together and give these children a cafeteria. Okay, church got quiet.
Just quickly, during that time, everything that got integrated was done by force,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That's
yeah.
why we had
That's
to.
a good point.
That's why the National Guard had to go to Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957,
That's
right?
a good point.
And in 1964 and 5, all of those integration policies got forced by the federal government that withheld funding if you didn't do that. So human beings don't naturally give up power, Christian or not, right? We just have a struggle with that. And so it's a deeper problem. But I think also the context is specific. People groups minister to each other better because they understand each other. And that's why it's still, Oakwood University is still necessary,
Amen.
right? Because when my students tell me my excuse, they might tell the same excuse to another counterpart who might believe them. And I'll be like, really? Because I think you said that last week.
Yes.
Or I went through that too, and this is how you overcome it. So there's a relatability factor that makes specific people group organizations necessary, separate but equal. But let's work on the equal part
Okay.
if we're going to keep this separate, right?
And staying with you, and we have an audience who is listening who is not from our background in terms of Adventism. So we're kind of in the micro with this separate but equal. But if we back it up and make a wider lens, and you talked about that Little Rock, Arkansas, and then the bus ride, the Freedom Ride.
Right.
Did separate but equal hurt us as a people? And I'm talking about all of us.
There's a lot.
Desegregation.
There's a lot
Which
of
which
research
hurt us
on
worse,
it.
separate but equal or desegregation?
So economically, we had a lot more when we were segregated because we worked together. We had more businesses, we had more community. So it politically was a good thing. But in our communities, in reality, it hasn't always fared so well.
Yes.
Because when we separated, that pulling together to support and help each other as we always had kind of diminished. So when you look at the inner cities, a lot of the times it's just a grouping of the lower income people. When before that, everybody lived together. So we kind of learned from each other and supported and helped each other more. The theory behind it might have been good and might have been had good intentions, might have. But the implementation of it didn't wholesale work as they might have thought it would.
Hurt.
Or maybe they thought it would.
Well, there's no question. We suffered the law of unintended consequences.
Yes.
We saw that we cannot be legally discriminated against and America be America.
Right.
At the same time, the law of unintended consequences is that when all the doors were opened, the least able to take advantage of the new opportunities were left in our urban communities. Even here in Huntsville, for those who may be watching, we opened our Community Health Action Center. Healthcare had never been in the Northwest. Now Huntsville Hospital is here, right? Renting space from Oakwood to deliver health care in the most underserved zip code, by the way, which is the one that Oakwood is in, the most underserved zip code in Huntsville. So I think there was the law of unintended consequences kicked in, and the least able were left. But that's why God makes us more able, so that we can go back and care for the least of these. That's why He does that.
And the laws definitely needed to be overturned.
Yes,
Because
yes.
anytime you codify discrimination and racism, you have established a legal separation and an underclass, and you've legalized it. And that's what made Jim Crow last so long and become so much a part of the American fabric, because there was a legal stance from the Supreme Court in 1896 that says you're separate but equal, but that separate created a subcategory that we're still fighting to get out, that we're still fighting to overcome.
Malcolm, we took a group of leaders, USM leaders and AYM leaders last week to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. It is fascinating to watch this generation re-experience things that you and I have grown up with. And one of the questions becomes, what are we doing to validate and to make sure that this history lives, that when they look at these stones, when they look at an Oakwood University, I mean, I think about this beautiful church. When you come in after 1974, this is all you've ever seen. But some of us remember worshiping in the gymnasium. And before me, others remember worshiping in Moran Hall. And before then, in other places. So how do we keep the history alive so that the generation doesn't grow up believing, Dr. Shaver, that somehow, remember when Obama was elected, well, all of that's done now. See, that's your generation was worried about. Although there's no data to really support that we're in a post-racial society. There's no housing data, there's no income data, and I can just walk down, there's no healthcare data, there's no educational data that says that all of that is behind us. We still have a lot of work to do.
We actually have all the data to say to the contrary.
Say just the opposite.
And so right now we are in the process of an initiative to talk about Dred Scott, and we had some community students do paintings and to watch, and these were mostly young Caucasian, but to hear their take on and the power of the history that they had never heard is amazing. So it's so important that we tell our story, right? We need to control the narrative because we already have all the evidence that when we leave it to the country or the education system to tell our history, it's not always a fair history. It's not always an accurate history. It's definitely not comprehensive, right? So that's our responsibility.
Okay. And how do we keep from losing our history? Because our generation behind us and the generation behind them, it seems like it's a dense fog.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things we have to do is we have to tell the stories, right? We have to really tell the stories. One of my favorite writers, Chinua Achebe, is a Nigerian writer, and he has this quote. He said, if the lion fails to tell the story of the hunt, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
Wow. Yes.
If the lion doesn't tell the story will glorify somebody else.
Right. And the power of a single story.
And
right?
the power of a single story.
When you have one single story, and that's the only story, right? Anybody who's not featured in that story doesn't exist, right? Or they're not important. They're marginalized, right? And so it's imperative that we keep our own history ever before us. That's why Black History Month is very important. And that's why Oakwood University and schools, Pine Forge, and historically Black colleges are imperative for not just us, but for the truth of the country, the truth of American history, the real truth, not the sanitized truth that we like to hear, right? Not everything's okay, but the whole truth, because it's not truth unless it's accurate.
All right. Well, let's draw that lens in a little bit deeper, because that same verbiage, right? Separate but equal. Let's cut that. Let's desegregate, and now let's make one conference. Let's have one university as a hub, and then Oakwood University is a part of sister schools. You know, this inclusiveness that is veiled, because we understand that desegregation hurt us. So let's speak to that, because we have some people who actually feel like there's no need for regional conferences. There's no need for Oakwood University to stand alone as an HBCU, and they can just be a part of. So can we speak to that energy?
So structuring for mission is important. So let me go back into the Adventist history. The Adventist understood structure as a tool for the effective accomplishment of mission. A lot of scholars have researched and written on this. Barry Oliver, George Knight, Organizing to Beat the Devil. There are lots of books that you can cite. Okay, so what's important is to understand the purpose for which the organization functions and how it structures. And what structure does is it establishes the allocation of resources, human and financial, in the accomplishment of mission. So when people say, we don't need these structures, implicitly they may be saying, you don't need the finances and you don't need the personnel. So you don't, because it begins to, the domino effect begins to work.
Right.
So if mission is the priority, then the only thing that the early Adventists were concerned about was how to get the gospel to people groups, the farthest and the fastest. Someone would have to make a great case for why our people group doesn't need the mobilized, organized resources to accomplish our mission in healthcare, in education, and in ministry. So for me, as I've written about this, I've said, I just don't see a gospel mandate that requires that. Now, some will quote Ephesians 2 and say, well, he has torn down the middle wall of partition. But that middle wall between Jew and Gentile was a wall of hostility. So where there is hostility, we need to tear the wall down. But I don't see a wall of hostility today. I see people groups, whoever they are, trying to accomplish the mission to their people group and trying to get the gospel to go the farthest and the fastest.
I think the Great Commission, right, when we look at the disciples, they started at home, right? They started with the people who they knew, who knew them, and who they had the same culture. Paul was